Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and I'm one of the co-founders here at Red Chip Poker. This episode, titled Tactics versus Strategies, is for poker players who found themselves asking, do I actually know the EV here, or am I just purely guessing? If you've ever been confused about what separates solid strategic thinking from laser-sharp tactical execution, this one is for you. Coach Weasel kicks things off by breaking down the age-old strategy versus tactics debate, using everything from war analogies to chess forks, and then ties it all back to poker in a way that actually makes sense. You'll learn why knowing your EV on the river is possible, but expecting to know it preflop? Not so much. More importantly, you'll come away with a framework to navigate early street uncertainty like a pro, and how to recognize profitable tactical spots when they finally emerge. Whether you're an online grinder or a live reg, or just someone who wants to level up their thought process, this episode will sharpen your strategic lens and fine-tune your tactical toolkit. With that said, here's Coach Weasel to break it all down. Enjoy.
What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. The title of this episode is Tactics versus Strategy. We're going to be discussing a possible use of these two terms in a poker context. And to help us get the ball rolling, it makes sense to consider how the terms tactics and strategy are used in other domains. As a rough overview, strategy refers to a broad overall view of our objectives. Sometimes we hear the term high level. Now, high level can be a bit confusing. For example, if I say that I've studied a certain topic to a high level, that would imply that I have a strong knowledge of that topic. But usually when we're dealing with more technical domains, the terms high level and low level tend to get reversed. High level implies a very broad knowledge of a specific topic without understanding the granular details of the topic. In other words, a low level understanding of a specific topic is more advanced than a high level understanding. Think about a plane flying over terrain at a very high altitude. It's flying at a high level. It's impossible to make out the individual details of what's taking place on the ground. Whereas the term low level implies a very granular understanding. Imagine now that that plane is at a much lower altitude. It can begin to pinpoint individual features of the terrain. The term strategy typically refers to high level, whereas the term tactics typically refers to low level. So while strategy is a broad overview of our overall objectives, tactics refer to specific actions or techniques that contribute to our strategy. One final analogy, if it helps, is to think about the difference between a battle and a war. A war is a campaign consisting of many battles. The way we engineer our overall approach to the campaign, well, that is strategy. The way we fight individual battles as part of the war, now that's tactics. To give you a common example, think about the game of chess. Now, I understand that not everyone listening is necessarily a chess player, although I have noticed that there are quite a few chess players in the Red Chip Poker Discord. So we'll try and keep this as generic as possible, although some basic understanding of chess may be helpful for the analogy. And the term strategy and tactics are used frequently in discussions regarding the game of chess. So in chess, strategy, once again, refers to the broader overview. Example of chess strategy would be principled positional play in the opening and early middle game. Generally, the way that chess works, players are not immediately attacking each other out of the gate. There's a period of time where players are setting up their pieces, and as they do that, they are thinking forward to what might happen in the future, and they're placing their pieces in logical positions for when the fighting does break out. When we think about tactics in chess, a tactic in chess refers to a specific fork, pin, skewer, discovery, or combination of moves that damages our opponent. These are all names of specific types of attack in chess. If you're not already familiar with them and you're interested in the game, feel free to look up each of these techniques. It will improve your chess game. But the way that chess typically works is, for a period of time, everything's strategy. No one's really attacking anyone. It's just strategy, strategy. Everything is slowly building. Strategy. Till all of a sudden, one of the players spots a very specific combination that unequivocally damages their opponent's position. The idea behind something like a fork in chess, for example, it's a move that attacks two of our opponent's pieces at once. And it's very difficult for our opponent to save both pieces. So as a result, our opponent can usually save one piece. Our opponent ends up down a piece. It's very, very clear that as a result of that tactic, that short-term technique, that our opponent's game has now become damaged. Now, the way that chess works is at that point, there could be a series of tactical maneuvers, or our opponent decides to consolidate his position. Everything's back to strategy again. It's quietened down. Both players are now thinking about the overall objectives, all the while being alert for a specific tactic that may present itself. Hopefully at this stage, we have a fairly good basic idea of the difference between the terms strategy and tactics and how they're used in a specific domain, for example, chess in this case. Question is, can we take these two terms and apply them to poker? And I would say that the answer is a categoric yes. I certainly use these terms on a regular basis when talking about the game of poker. So how can we define strategy and how can we define tactics in the domain of poker? Here are my definitions. Strategy. Strategy in poker revolves around principled decisions, usually on the early streets, where our specific expected value is unknown. Now, you might be thinking, well, of course, all good poker players know what their EV is at any given point in a hand of poker. Well, you might be surprised. More on that a little bit later. For now, think about strategy as a play you make on an early street where you think it's the right thing to do, but you can't categorically state that this is definitely increasing my EV. You just suspect that it probably does. A tactic in poker is a specific line, usually on later streets, where the EV is known to be positive. In other words, the expected value is calculable and demonstrable. We can essentially prove that the expected value is positive and cite a specific value for what we think the EV of the line is. But hold on a moment, let's go back to our previous question. Don't good poker players always know what their EV is? Isn't that the whole point of being a poker player? You know, regardless of the street, what your expected value is when you make a decision. After all, if you don't know your expected value, how do you make the decision? Okay, is what we're saying accurate? Let's take a step back here. Let's ask the question, don't poker players, and by poker players we mean good poker players in this context, don't poker players always know their EV? It may seem that way when you hear conversations among winning players, for example. They may give the impression that they always know what their expected value is on any street, regardless of whether it's the flop or pre-flop. But the truth is, it is not possible to know the expected value of early street decisions the majority of the time, and it's to do with what we can refer to as the exponential growth problem in poker. For example, let's work back from the river. Let's imagine a river situation. We're thinking about launching a bluff against our opponent, and let's say we are able to access certain variables. We know our opponent's folding frequency, for example, against a bet of a given size. How do we know that? Maybe through watching our opponent play, maybe through HUD stats we have on our opponent, maybe through pool data. We know how often our opponent is folding. Well, if we know the size of our bet and we know how often our opponent is folding, we can calculate the EV of a river bet. It's actually very, very straightforward because there aren't really too many variables involved. Now let's take a step back and imagine a turn situation. Let's say we're thinking about semi-bluffing the turn. Do we know our EV in that situation? In many cases, the answer is yes, but it's a lot more complex to estimate our exact EV. Because if our bluff on the turn fails, we have to think about all of the possible things that could happen on the river. Do we fire again on the river? Do we check? Understanding the EV of the turn decision needs to factor in all of the possible actions that could take place on the river. That might be fairly straightforward with a hand that doesn't have a lot going for it in the way of equity. We can make sweeping generalizations such as, well, if my bluff fails because my opponent raises, I know that I can just fold. Or if my bluff fails on the turn, I know that I never hit anything on the river, so I don't need to factor in any chance of me being paid out because I'm just going to give up every time. But when we start analyzing hands that do have some kind of potential, things like flush draws, for example, or things like pairs, things start to get a bit more complex. We have to start thinking, if our opponent raises, do I call? If I bet on the turn, how often will I have a flush draw on the river and be able to value bet? If I value bet, how often does my opponent call? How often does he raise? Can I continue against the raise? Should I 3-bet? What would my 3-bet sizing be? How often does my opponent defend against that? What is his calling range? How much equity does my hand have against his calling range? You can see that we have many additional decision nodes to factor in, and all of those are a requirement in order to know the EV of the initial turn bet. Now that's just going from turn to river. There are still many situations where we can make a very good guess of the expectation going from turn to river. But the reason why we describe this as an exponential growth problem is that when we go back an earlier street, we're now on the flop. In order to understand the expected value of a flop bet, we need to factor in all of the possible actions that may occur on the turn, and for each of those possible actions, all of the possible actions that may occur on the river. And if we head back a step further to preflop play, knowing the expected value of a preflop decision is very difficult, because for every preflop action, we need to factor in all flop actions, for every flop action, all turn actions, and for every turn action, all river actions. The tree starts becoming very, very large, becomes very difficult for a human to make reasonable estimates regarding their EV, or whether their EV is even positive. The upshot of this is that we often might be able to know our EV on the turn and river, but knowing the EV of a flop decision or pre-flop, it really does depend on the situation. There are many spots where it's not practical to know our flop EV, depending on our opponent's tendencies. Now, the counter argument to that might be, well, that's why we have solver output, right? Solver output just tells us what the EV of early street decisions is. In fact, I can pull up a pre-flop chart, shows me all of the hands I should be defending along with their respective EVs, and those pre-flop EVs take into account the entire post-flop game tree. So we do know our expected value. Well, kind of, but not really. What we have to keep in mind is that a solver game tree and the actions that our opponent is going to be taking as part of that game tree don't necessarily map very well to reality. That might be the solver's interpretation of our EV, but that doesn't necessarily mean that our actual EV is anywhere close to that, because our opponent is not playing like solver. Okay, so does that mean that we're completely in the dark regarding what we should be doing on the flop and what we should be doing pre-flop? And the answer is absolutely not. This is where strategy comes in. So a tactics, when we know that our EV is positive, this is the max EV line, let's proceed down that path. Strategy, we don't necessarily know what our EV is, but that doesn't mean we have no idea regarding what the best play is. It's reasonable to assume that we can increase our expected value overall through principled or strategic, to use our nomenclature, decisions. Let's think about some examples. A weak player at the table open raises preflop. We're in the big blind with a hand that's usually outside of our defending range. We suspect there may be profitable post-flop opportunities if we expand our preflop defending range. Do we know the exact EV of our preflop defend? Virtually impossible to know that. Is it reasonable to think that we might increase our expected value by playing more pots against weaker players? Yeah, absolutely. This is a principled strategic decision. We don't know the exact EV, but it's reasonable to assume that it will increase our EV in the long run. Another example as it pertains to exploitative play is thinking about the importance of pot growth with strong hands. Basic principle of exploitative bet sizing in poker is that if you have something very strong like a nut draw or a strong value hand, you want to increase the size of your bets. Make sure the pot grows larger on average. If you have something that's dominated or very mid-strength, it usually makes sense to limit the size of the pot. Now, these are definitely exploitative principles. GTO doesn't necessarily fully agree with the statements that we've made, but generally, exploitatively, this is how we think about pot growth. We want to play a large pot when we're strong and a smaller pot when we're weak. It's actually very, very simple when you think about it. Who would have thought that poker could actually be that simple? Of course, poker is a bit more complex. It does depend on the caliber of your opponents, but that's the basic idea at a really simple exploitative level. Let's say, for example, that we've flopped a set, our opponent is a calling station, and we decide to make a really big flop bet because we don't think our opponent's going anywhere. Can we state categorically what the EV of that bet is? Actually, we can't. There are still too many variables at play. We don't know our opponent's exact folding frequencies against every possible bet size on each street. We can't therefore know our exact EV. And even if we can guess out our EV, we really don't know which line is max EV. It depends upon being able to access variables or information about our opponent, which we simply don't know the values for. We don't know our EV. Is it reasonable to assume, however, that sizing up value against an opponent with stationary tendencies is going to increase our EV in the long run? Absolutely. On an even broader level, does it make sense to assume that by actively going out of our way to grow the pot when we have high equity is also going to increase our expected value in the long run? Once again, this absolutely makes sense. This is an example of a strategic principle. We don't know how much we're increasing our EV by, we just know that it probably makes sense. We also typically find that acting strategically on the earlier streets usually leads to more profitable, more straightforward decisions on the later streets. For example, imagine that we were routinely growing the pot with mid-strength equity on the earlier streets. We're going to have some difficult decisions on the turn and river because we didn't keep the size of the pot small. We find that if we play strategically very well, then tactical opportunities have a tendency to present themselves more frequently. Very, very similar to chess. If you have a solid position, you're going to be able to produce tactics from that position. If your position is strategically very poor, it's going to be a lot harder to find relevant tactics. Same in poker. If you play strategically on the earlier betting rounds, you're going to see an abundance of additional profitable tactics make themselves available for the later street betting rounds. Now, just to be clear, there are some situations where we should know our EV, and there are some situations where it's okay to not know our EV. Generally, turn and river situations, we should be able to make an estimate regarding our EV. So if you can't do this, then there's probably some work you need to do on your game. Talking about certain river bluff situations, we should have a rough idea what the EV of those river bluffs is. This includes many turn spots, things like delayed C bets on the turn, pro bets on the turn, pro bets on the river, stop and go lines on the river. We should have a rough idea of what our EV is when we fire, because it's something that we can calculate using fairly simplified models. It's also true that we should know our expected value on early street situations where we're exploiting overfolders. So imagine, for example, we have an opponent who just folds way too much to 3 bets or folds way too much to flop C bets. Generally, it's a lot easier to estimate the EV in that situation because the majority of the expectation is produced by the fact that our opponent is overfolding. So even if we can't be extremely precise, we should be able to make reasonable estimates regarding our EV, even on the earlier streets. However, if our opponent is not really folding very much pre-flop or on the flop, this is where we start to run into that exponential growth problem, and we have no choice but to play strategically until irrelevant tactical opportunities present themselves. In order to figure out our EV, we can make use of EV modeling techniques. When translated, this means making use of tools to map the game tree and make estimates regarding our EV. Examples include making use of a spreadsheet, i.e. Excel, making use of tree building software such as Cardrunner's EV, and in some cases you can hack around with a solver as well to make some basic estimates regarding what our EV is in certain situations. The only thing is we don't want to trust raw EV output from the early streets of a solver because it won't be representative. We actually have to make use of extensive node locking techniques to be able to use the solver as an EV measuring tool. To put things simply, the solver isn't really designed for measuring your exploitative EV. It's very difficult to get the solver to do that. It's often simpler to make use of something like a spreadsheet or something like Cardrunner's EV to EV model situations on the later streets, or in some cases the earlier streets, but it's much harder, as we mentioned. Okay, let's think about some key takeaways from this discussion on tactics versus strategy. One interesting takeaway is that you're not supposed to know your EV in every spot. Sometimes strong winning players might give that impression that they always know what their EV is, but the truth is, it's virtually impossible to know your EV, especially pre-flop, especially on the flop. We only start to get a clearer picture of what our EV should be in turn and river situations where the size of the remaining game tree is reduced. And when we do have that high level of vision over our EV, we can refer to it as a tactic. Whereas if we really can't estimate our EV, the remaining game tree is too complex, we can still play according to principled decisions, which we can refer to as strategic poker. The principled strategy decisions involve things that are very logical, even though we don't necessarily know our precise EV. Could be, for example, isolating against weaker players, ISO raising, for example, 3-betting to ISO, growing the size of the pot in key situations, limiting the size of the pot in other situations. It's very difficult to know the precise EV benefit of doing these things, but in terms of principles, we expect it to increase our EV in the long run, and we expect it to put us in more favorable tactical situations later on in the game tree if we play strategically well early on in the game tree. The basic objective, very similar to what we described with chess. We play strategically, then a tactical opportunity presents itself. We take that tactical opportunity. And the idea with a tactic in poker is it takes you to the end of the game tree. So it'll be a combination. We'll play the flop strategically. We'll have, let's say, a turn pro bet opportunity, and we know that we can follow up on the river. So the tactic presents itself, we probe the turn, we follow up the river. As we mentioned in chess, you might then go back to playing strategically, whereas in poker, you're at the end of the hand. So a tactic in poker represents your path from your current situation to the end of the game tree. And it has to be that way because if you don't reach the end of the game tree, either by reaching the river or because your opponent folds, well, you can't calculate your EV in that case. So that's the difference between tactics in chess and tactics in poker. After a chess tactic, the game might continue. After a poker tactic, you've reached the end of the game tree. It's time for the next hand of poker. All right, hopefully that's given you something to think about in terms of strategy versus tactics in poker. Thanks very much for listening. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully you enjoyed, and if you did, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes. If you're interested in going further and really practicing both general strategy along with spot-specific tactics, our workbooks are the best way to do precisely that. With workbooks dedicated to post-flop play, live play, and even advanced spots, you'll get hundreds of questions and reps doing the work that makes your real-time play so much stronger. Just visit redchippoker.com/books, BOOKS, and find the workbook that's right for you. If nothing else, having a complete roadmap with practical exercises for actual improvement is worth every penny. Again, that's redchippoker.com/books to find your next workbook today. That's going to be it for today's episode. We'll see you back with a brand new one soon, and in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.